On September 8, 1941, German troops with the support of the Finns closed the blockade ring around Leningrad, one of the most important strategic, economic, and cultural centers of the USSR. On January 18, 1943, Soviet troops broke through the blockade, and the city again received land communication with the main territory of the country. This improved the situation in besieged Leningrad. The resumption of supplies made it possible to increase the standards of food and fuel, corresponding to the level of other large industrial centers. However, the city was not completely liberated from the siege. German troops continued to shell Leningrad and its strategically important railway. The enemy intensively used artillery and aviation. In September, 5,000 shells were fired at the city, and from March to May 1943, German aircraft bombed 69 times. Only in the autumn of 1943, thanks to the efforts of Soviet fighter aircraft and air defense, the air threat to the city decreased significantly. On the night of October 17, 1943, the last enemy bomb fell on Leningrad, and the blockade finally weakened. Despite the harsh combat conditions and the shortage of labor, the Leningrad industry continued to work and increased the production of military products. The production of large-caliber naval artillery resumed in the city, and from the third quarter of 1943, mass production of artillery shells and mortar shells began. The construction of small ships and boats, including the minesweepers necessary for the fleet, also began. In conditions of austerity of raw materials, fuel, and electricity, 85 large industrial enterprises were partially restored, and by the end of the year, their number had increased to 186. According to Fedyuninsky, by the end of 1943, the situation near Leningrad was determined by the general situation on the fronts. The Soviet army inflicted a series of powerful blows on the German troops, forcing them to retreat, and by November, almost two-thirds of the territory captured by the enemy had been liberated. However, near Leningrad, the Nazis strengthened their positions, hoping to hold them as a key link in the Eastern Front. The task of completely lifting the siege of Leningrad became vital for ensuring the security of the city and the development of the offensive on the northern flank of the front. This not only opened the way to the Baltic states, but also contributed to the liberation of Karelia, the defeats of Finland, and ensuring the access of the Soviet fleet to the Baltic. The forces of the parties. The German Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Kuhler, included 741,000 soldiers and officers, 10,070 guns and mortars, 385 tanks and assault guns, as well as 370 aircraft. Over the course of 2.5 years, the enemy has created powerful defensive positions, including reinforced concrete fortifications, numerous bunkers, wire fences, and minefields. All settlements in the defense zone were turned into resistance centers and strongholds, and especially strong fortifications were located in the area south of Pulkovo Heights and north of Novgorod. The Nazis considered their northern rampart impregnable. The troops of the Leningrad, Volkhov, and Second Baltic fronts, numbering 1,252,000 people, with 20,183 guns and mortars, 1,580 tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as 1,386 combat aircraft, had to resist this powerful army group. The plans of the parties. In early September 1943, the Soviet command learned that German troops had begun preparations to retreat from Leningrad, planning defenses on the new Panther Line, from the Narva River to Lake Peipsy, Pskov, and Idritsa. In response, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts immediately began to develop a plan for a large-scale operation to completely liberate the city. Due to the uncertainty in the plans of the German troops, the Soviet command prepared two offensive options. The first, Neva 1, provided for the pursuit of the enemy in the event of his retreat, and the second, Neva 2, was aimed at breaking through his defenses if the enemy continued to hold positions. The situation for the German Army Group North was deteriorating. Due to the powerful offensives of the Soviet troops on other fronts, the German command could not strengthen its positions in the northwestern direction. From July 1943, Quayler had to transfer combat-ready divisions to Army Groups Center and South, while less trained units were sent to the north. Knowing about the readiness of the Soviet troops for the offensive, Kuchler appealed to the Führer with a request to accelerate the withdrawal of troops to the Panther Line. However, despite the information about the possible threat, the Führer, guided by the opinion of the commander of the 18th Army, ordered the siege of Leningrad to continue. The German command was given the task of continuing the blockade of the city in order to maintain control over strategically important regions and ensure the freedom of action of the fleet in the Baltic Sea. The Soviet headquarters, taking into account the proposals of the military councils of the fronts, approved a plan for a large-scale operation to defeat the German 18th Army. The main goal was to launch simultaneous attacks by the forces of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts to destroy the Peterhof, Strelninsk, and Novgorod enemy groups. After that, developing the offensive in the Kingisepp and Luga directions, it was planned to complete the defeat of the 18th Army. At the next stage, with the participation of all three fronts, it was planned to defeat the German 16th Army and liberate the Leningrad and Kalinin regions. The operation was prepared with great care. The troops regrouped to create strike groups. The Second Shock Army under the command of General Fedyuninsky was secretly transported by ship from Leningrad and Lysynos to the Oranienbaum area. This bridgehead, located west of the city, was surrounded by enemy troops, but the support of the Kronstadt fortress allowed him to cover Kronstadt from land. The Oranienbaum bridgehead played a key role in the subsequent defeat of the enemy. In the period from November 1943 to January 1944, 53,000 people, 658 guns, tanks, cars, tractors, and tens of thousands of tons of ammunition were delivered here in difficult weather conditions. It is important that the Germans were misled into believing that Soviet troops were being transferred from the bridgehead to the city, which made it possible to conceal the true intentions of the Soviet command. Beginning of the operation. On January 14, 1944, the troops of the Leningrad front under the command of General Govorov launched an offensive. Troops of the Second Shock Army attacked from the Oranienbaum bridgehead in the direction of Ropsha. Initially, the artillery of the Army and the Baltic Fleet delivered a powerful blow to the enemy's positions, which brought down more than 100,000 shells and mines on the German positions. After that, the infantry went on the attack, working closely with tanks and artillery. The Germans put up stubborn resistance, and every meter of land had to be retaken with battles. The next day, Fedyuninsky's troops repulsed up to 30 counterattacks. At the same time, General Maslennikov's 42nd Army was advancing with fierce fighting, striking from the Volkhov Heights area. By the third day of the operation, the Second Shock Army had broken through the enemy's main line of defense, advancing 8 to 10 kilometers deep, and the breakthrough had expanded to 23 kilometers. On January 19th, Ropsha was taken, an important stronghold, and troops advancing from the Volkhov Heights captured Krasny Selo. Units of the 2nd Shock and 42nd Armies of the Leningrad front met here, which led to the defeat of the Peterhof-Strelninsk group of the German 18th Army. During the 6 days of offensive fighting, the troops of the Leningrad front advanced 25 kilometers into the depth of the enemy's defenses, and the German artillery bombarding Leningrad from the Duderhof, Voranya Gora area fell silent forever. On January 14, 1944, the Volkhov front under the command of General Meretskov went on the offensive. The main attack was carried out north of Novgorod, in difficult conditions of a wooded and swampy area, by the 59th Army under the command of General Korovnikov. After an hour and a half of artillery preparation, the tanks and infantry moved into enemy positions. Bad weather made it difficult for artillery to fire accurately, and low clouds prevented aviation from participating in the preparation of the offensive until the second day. Some of the tanks got stuck in the swamp due to the thaw, but despite the obstacles, the troops continued their offensive. As Marshal Meretskov recalled, separate regiments of the 6th and 14th Rifle Corps reached the line of attack a few minutes before the end of the artillery preparation. The blow turned out to be so powerful and swift that the first line of German defense was breached, and on January 15th, the Novgorod-Chudovo Railway was cut. The southern group of troops of the 59th Army crossed Lake Ilmen on ice at night, cutting the Novgorod-Shimsk Railway, which threatened German communications from the south. The troops continued their successful offensive, breaking through the main enemy defense line north of Novgorod. Field Marshal Kukler was forced to withdraw the 24th and 21st Divisions from their positions near Mgoy and Chudovo, as well as the 290th and 8th Divisions from near Solts and Staraya Russa, transferring them to the area of Liberated to close the gap. However, the Soviet troops continued their offensive, not giving the enemy a break. On the morning of January 20th, 1944, the northern and southern groups of troops joined west of Novgorod. On the same day, the city was liberated from German troops by a decisive assault. As Meretskov recalled, there was dead silence in the streets. The whole city was destroyed. Only about 40 buildings remained intact, and the greatest monuments of Russian architecture were blown up. At the same time, the 8th and 54th Armies of the Volkhov Front were actively operating, pinning down enemy forces in the Tusnensky, Lubansky, and Monstrous directions, preventing him from transferring troops to Novgorod. The threat of encirclement forced the German command to withdraw units of the 18th Army from the eastern Tosno and Chudovo salient. The Soviet offensive unfolded along the entire front from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ilmen. The troops of the Leningrad front liberated Pushkin, Pavlovsk, and Gachina, and by the end of January reached the border of the Luga River. The Volkhov front, advancing towards Luga and Shimsk, liberated important cities and stations such as Munga, Tosno, Lyuban, and Chudovo, and also cleared the Oktyabrskaya Railway from German troops. At this time, the Second Baltic Front under the command of General Popov was pinning down the forces of the German 16th Army. Thus, the Red Army successfully destroyed the Severny Val and completely eliminated the enemy blockade of Leningrad. On January 27th, in the evening, a solemn artillery salute of 324 guns thundered in the liberated city. The historic victory was joyfully celebrated not only by Leningrad, but also by the entire Soviet people. After the heavy defeat at the front, the Hitlerite headquarters, as usual, hid its true causes. Field Marshal Kukler was replaced by Colonel General Model, known for his reputation as a specialist in strategic defense. The Soviet troops continued their offensive. On February 1st, the Second Shock Army of the Leningrad Front crossed the Luga River and stormed Kingisepp. The 42nd Army, advancing to the south, liberated Gdov on February 4th, which was occupied by the partisans. The Volkhov Front, having defeated the enemy's Luga group, occupied Luga on February 12th, after which it was disbanded and its armies were transferred to the Leningrad Front. The advancing troops reached the Narva River line. The enemy's 18th Army retreated, and soon the 16th Army also retreated. Pursuing her, the troops of the Second Baltic Front liberated Staraya Russa on February 18th, and then Kolm. On the right flank of the Leningrad Front, troops entered the territory of Soviet Estonia, and on the left flank, in cooperation with the Second Baltic Front, they occupied an important railway junction, the Dino station. By the end of February, the advancing Soviet troops stopped at the Narva-Pskov-Ostrov line, where they took up defense. The moment has come to regroup forces, replenish troops, equipment, and ammunition, as well as tighten the rear. Result: after a month-and-a-half offensive in the northwestern direction, the Red Army inflicted a heavy defeat on Army Group North, pushing it 220 to 280 kilometers to the west. 3 German divisions were destroyed, and 17 divisions were defeated. Almost the entire territory of the Leningrad and Kalinin regions was liberated from the German invaders. During the operation, the southern and southeastern approaches to Leningrad were cleared. However, Finnish troops remained on its northern outskirts, who continued to participate in the blockade of the city. To completely liberate the city, it was necessary to defeat them on the Karelian Isthmus and in South Karelia. The Great Battle for Leningrad, one of the most brutal and bloody in the Great Patriotic War, which lasted 900 days, ended with the victory of the Red Army and the entire Soviet people. Despite incredible trials and huge losses, the hero city withstood this fierce struggle.